give me a shout when they appear. Right, can you see that okay?
Yes, that's fine, Oliver.
Yeah, lovely. Right, I'll get cracking then. Well, yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and found these meetings really useful and engaging. So I'm really glad that people are talking about food and farming. It's obviously a subject very dear to my heart, and I'm sure I could talk about it all evening if given the chance. So I'm sure you've probably heard about, well, possibly might not have heard of the NFU. We're the National Farmers Union. We represent about 55,000 farmers across England and Wales. We do lots of lobbying, campaigning, and also a huge amount of advice and guidance for members. Some of you may have seen the petition in the summer about food standards, farmers not wanting to be undercut by imported produce. And thank you to anyone who signed that. It's really fantastic, so much support. But more recently, a large part of our work, an increasingly large part of our work, involves helping the farming sector get to net zero, which is no small challenge. Now, there's quite a lot going on in the farming sector. I don't want to appear to be the moaning farmer. There's a lot of positive things going on at the moment as well, but I just wanted to give you a bit of background, just to put things in context, which will probably help you understand why people are saying the things they are. And I don't need to tell you about the climate emergency, that's kind of obvious, but I think farmers really are on the forefront of that. We've seen probably the wettest winter on record, followed by the driest and coldest April on record this year, you know, and ever more increasingly extreme weather, which really impacts on farmers perhaps more than anybody else. So really at the front end. And obviously there's the extra imperative of a loss of biodiversity as well, which farmers, as those who manage the land, need to help to address.
Great understanding, beef warning, God.
Sorry, I'll carry on. And as our exit from the European Union as well, and a general change in direction with UK farming policy means that farmers are trading in very different conditions to perhaps 18 months ago.
Ooh, that was right.
There's an ongoing downward price pressure as well. So discount retailers like Aldi and Lidl and others have entered the domain, and there's an ongoing price war. And generally, I think you'll all agree, this is by no means a criticism. You know, I say this as a non-farmer myself, but there's a widespread disconnect between consumers and the people producing food. So all lots of things going on. Now, as I said, farming is changing. From 2024, there'll be no production subsidies at all for farmers. In fact, the only money that they'll get from the government will be for environmental outcomes. So it's quite a sharp change in direction. Now, when it comes to sustainability, it's something I'm really passionate about. And I think when we're talking about net zero, we really need to start looking at sustainability in the whole rather than just carbon emissions. So I quickly wanted to touch on that before we talk about carbon emissions, climate change, things like that. So for me, there are three pillars of sustainability. I'm sure you've all seen this before: the social, the environment, and the economic. And obviously, carbon footprint probably sits in the middle there with the environment pillar, but there are a huge number of other things that we need to think about as well for farming systems to be sustainable. It's no good just focusing on the carbon footprint if we're going to sacrifice all these other things like people's way of life, accessibility, is what they're producing healthy, is there an even distribution of value along the supply chain? You know, are farmers getting a fair price? Is the market rewarding what they're doing fairly? So all manner of things that need to be taken into account. But obviously, when you balance them, you should get a sustainable system. And I like to think as well, by addressing carbon footprints, a lot of these things as well, the other pillars will come alongside that as well. So agricultural emissions then. Well, I'm sure you've seen graphs like this before. In the UK, farming and land use are about 10% of our carbon emissions. Within that, just over half is from methane, so mainly from ruminant livestock. Nitrous oxide is about a third. Most of this will come from fertilizer, but also from livestock manure as well. So within crop production, by far the biggest component of your carbon footprint is fertilizer use, which is something that a lot of farmers are focusing on at the moment. And then CO2, actually quite a small percentage. So unlike most other sectors, the footprint of farming is really dominated by non-CO2 gases, which makes it quite unique. Now, I should also say, and this is relevant, I'll talk about this later, but these figures are all CO2 equivalent. So there are various different metrics you can use. And I think for a sector that is dominated by non-CO2 gases, it can cause issues when you're measuring the footprint. But CO2 equivalent is sort of your standard measure now. But I'll come on to that in more detail. Just quickly, and I'm sure this will come up, but I mentioned that obviously the footprint of UK farming is dominated by methane, and to a certain extent there are issues with the way this is measured. It's no means trying to get farmers off the hook. You know, methane has a significant impact on the climate, but it's also a lot more short-lived than other greenhouse gases. And your usual way of measuring it in CO2 equivalent, many people would argue, doesn't really take into account the longevity of the greenhouse gas. And Miles Allen and his team at the Oxford Martin School have recently come up with a new metric, GWP star, which kind of rethinks the role of methane. And they really look at warming impact rather than CO2 equivalent. And essentially for the UK, they calculated that over 30 years, our agricultural methane emissions would only need to fall by 10%. So 1% over 30 years. So that's not right, is it? 3. And effectively that would mean that the warming impact would effectively be 0. If they were to fall by 25%, you'd have a significant cooling. So like I said, it's not to get farmers off the hook by any means, but I guess what it's showing is that depending on how you measure these impacts, you can paint a very different picture. And we also need to think about things like the carbon cycle as well. So obviously if those cows are grazing on grass, then regrowing, as the pasture recovers, you're not actually unlocking new carbon the same way as you would be with burning fossil fuels, for example. Again, really, really difficult to measure and to take into account. So like I said, not trying to get farmers off the hook, but it's important to sort of see the wider picture. It's something we're pushing quite heavily on, and we'd like to see the IPCC consider a new metric in the way they consider methane, because as these systems are currently measured, I think sectors that are dominated by CO2, heavy industries, things like that, almost look a bit better, and the agriculture sector looks a bit worse. And from our point of view, I don't think that's just necessarily a fair representation. So perhaps one for another debate there. And we also need to think about nutrient density of the food, because just measuring CO2 emissions per kilo of product doesn't really give the full picture. And for me, I think that when you're looking at cow's milk, you can see this clearly. So obviously, litre for litre, cow's milk, UK cow's milk, I should say, so that's got a footprint about 40% of the global average, versus a litre of oat milk. Obviously, it's got a higher carbon footprint, which is more nutritionally complex. But if you look at it sort of on a kilo of protein basis, your cow's milk actually has a lower footprint. Obviously, that would be a lot of milk you'd have to drink either way to get that kilo of protein. But what I'm trying to illustrate there is the way that you measure these things is really important. Otherwise, you're comparing apples to pears. And again, it's not necessarily a fair comparison, and not necessarily the best for basing decisions on. And again, I think there's concern about displacing what is actually often nutrient dense products with effectively highly processed food. And again, going back to the pillars of sustainability, is that socially sustainable if we're effectively encouraging people to move away from nutrient dense products to highly processed foods. So with this infographic here I put in again just to remind people that when we're talking about ruminants in the UK, You know, by far the biggest proportion of their diet comes from grass, crop byproducts, things like that. So we're not really talking about the grain-based systems that we thinking about perhaps in other countries. So again, they're turning things that we can't eat, i.e. grass, into what is a nutrient-dense food. So when we're talking about footprints and sustainability, we also need to think about these kind of questions as well. And it can get quite complicated. But I think from my point of view, it needs to be a little bit more nuanced than just kilos of CO2 equivalent, because it doesn't really show the picture, if that makes sense. So what about net zero then? Well, back in 2019, the farming sector put together a blueprint for how we see ourselves getting to net zero by 2040. And this is really just the first step. So we're still thrashing out the detail, but within the NFU now we have a dedicated team of people whose job it is to try and make this happen. And to be honest, we've seen a huge amount of support and interest from farmers as well. So by far the best attended webinars we've done over the last year have been those on net zero, carbon footprinting, regenerative agriculture, and not really had any pushback from members on this. So it's quite promising. Now, agriculture is uniquely placed, really, in the sense that it's obviously an emitter, but it's probably the only sector alongside forestry which has the potential to actually take up carbon as well and be part of the solution. And you've really got to think about it like a cycle. So we've got ruminants emitting greenhouse gases, but at the same time, crops and pasture are then taking up carbon and locking up. And the trick here really is to maximize the amount of carbon that we're locking up and minimize the amount of carbon that we're emitting. Whereas compare that to other sectors that are a lot more based around essentially unlocking carbon in the form of fossil fuels. So we're really trying to position the farming sector as part of the solution as well. We have a role to play clearly in doing our bit to get emissions down as low as possible and to hit net zero. So it's quite an exciting prospect, and perhaps puts agriculture in the limelight like it hasn't been in the past. So how do we see that happening? Well, our team at HQ looked at where agricultural emissions are coming from, and they split that into three key pillars. And the first one is productivity. So that's really around, you think of it like efficiency. So basically produce as much as you can from as little as possible. Number two is farmland carbon storage. So that would be things like growing hedges out, trees, locking up as much carbon as possible on farm. And then pillar three is around bioenergy. So how can we use farming to offset the need for fossil fuels in other sectors? And I think from our point of view, there's always going to be some sort of emissions associated with agriculture, just because of the nature of what's involved. So you're always going to have something from ruminants, from working with soil, from fertilizer. So a chunk of this is going to be around offsetting the carbon needs of other sectors. So just going through this in a bit more detail then, pillar one, I talked about productivity. For crop producers, a huge part of that is going to be around more efficient use of nutrients. Like I said, by far the biggest part of your footprint as a crop producer is fertilizer. So the more farmers can do to absolutely minimize nutrient inputs and use them as efficiently as possible makes a huge difference.
Oliver, can I just break in? We're losing your voice a little bit. You're breaking up.
No, that's right. I'll sit a bit closer. Sorry, the microphone's not very good on Zoom. Just shout if you can't hear me again, Colin.
Okay. Apologies for interrupting.
No, that's fine. And then obviously on the livestock front, looking at how we can reduce those methane emissions. People are talking about seaweed in livestock diets. Reducing methane by as much as 96%, which is huge. Healthy animals are a lot more efficient. So making sure that they have exactly the right diet and are free of disease. And focusing on soil health as well. So we've talked about regenerative agriculture in the past, and that's going to be absolutely crucial. Healthy soil means you don't need as many inputs, and you'll get a much more efficient production. And possibly, I appreciate this is controversial, and we've had the consultation on it, but some people see a role for, for gene edited crops in this process as well. And perhaps the most crucial thing above all is no waste. It's the simplest thing we can do, whether you're a consumer or a farmer. And hopefully we'll see lots of government support for this as well. So quickly, just touching on soil health then, this is kind of what it would look like for your average farmer around here in East Anglia. These are sheep grazing on fields of oilseed rape. So obviously the manure from the sheep helps fertilize the soil, lock up carbon by bringing organic matter back into the soil, and it reduces the need for any kind of inputs. So what they're doing here is they're grazing the oilseed rape, and it will regrow in the spring. And because there won't be the leaves on it, there won't be the need for well, there hopefully won't be the need for pest and disease control, and like I said, they'll help condition the soil as well. So it's quite simple things like this farmers will be looking to do to lock up carbon and maximise productivity. Now on to pillar 2. This is probably, I think we think there's a lot of quite easy wins in here for farmers. So things like letting your hedgerows grow out, planting trees on farm. These are established techniques, and there's quite a bit of funding coming around for large scale tree planting. As part of the new environmental management schemes as well, we'll see a lot of incentives for farmers to maximise the carbon they can store through their hedgerows. And hopefully with woodland and shelter belt planting as well, you'll bring benefits if you've got livestock there as well, because you'll have more shelter. Not so many peatlands and wetlands around here, but it's a big part of the solution as well. And the top one, soil carbon storage, again, perhaps focusing on how you can lock up carbon in your soil, whether that's reducing cultivation, getting organic matter into there through livestock or cover crops. We've talked about it at previous events. And there are a number of farmers in this part of the world who are doing really, really great things in this respect. Right. And the third one is around bioenergy and also carbon capture and storage, which is, we're potentially breaking new ground here, but there are commercially viable systems in place already. Now, the way I see it happening is highly vigorous crops, perhaps things like hemp or miscanthus that don't need many inputs, are almost carbon positive because they grow so vigorously. They take up that much CO2, that little in the way of inputs, that they're sucking carbon out of the atmosphere readily. And you can use them for fiber, perhaps as biofuels as well, to generate energy and displace fossil fuels. So there's quite a lot of potential there. I think we need to make sure we use wool as readily as we can. It's exactly the same as using a crop product for insulation. You're taking carbon out of the atmosphere there. I know there's a lot of excitement about the possibility for natural fibers being used in construction as well. What we mean by bioenergy carbon capture and storage, though, is you'd use a sustainably produced biofuel, and then places like Drax Power Station up in Yorkshire could then capture that carbon dioxide, whether it's in cement or in other kind of solid forms they're experimenting with, and then you're effectively taking that out of the atmosphere at a seriously large scale, and generating energy as well. And one of the really exciting things for me that I've seen is down in Cornwall, the council there on their council farms are generating biomethane, so basically liquefied natural gas from cattle manure, to power their fleet of HGVs. Because as I understand it, although electric cars are surging ahead, heavy goods vehicles are kind of lagging behind, and no one's really got, or as far as I've seen anyway, a sort of an effective electric lorry just yet. So that's a potentially massive saving there. And then obviously, again, we'll be looking to have small scale renewables small and large scale renewables on farmland as well. And as the NFU, we set up a company called N0 to help farmers make the most of all these opportunities, whether it's putting solar panels on shed roofs, or sort of small scale renewables, that picture on the bottom left was an anaerobic digester. So again, if you've got livestock, you could put the manure into the AD plant, or if you've got crop byproducts or primary crops that you've not got a market for, you can put them in the AD plant, and then you get a nutrient-rich digestate out of it as well as energy. So there's loads of potential there. So what about new forms of farming then? I think kind of nothing is off the table, and these will kind of sit into those three pillars. I wanted to touch on vertical farming because it's something I'm sort of vaguely involved in, and actually in Bedfordshire we've just seen major investment in vertical farming by a company called Grow Pura, who are going to build a huge facility, I think linked with the Unilever site. So what it is effectively just stacking shelves of crops, growing them in a controlled environment, which allows you to absolutely minimize the amount of inputs you need. So going back to that productivity question, and to grow them year round, often in a sort of a hyper local format as well. Various questions about the sustainability of this, because obviously you've got an energy demand where you didn't have one before in the form of lights, and you need to think about where you're getting your nutrients from as well, because obviously they'll need fertilizer to grow in, and what's the impact of building that infrastructure in the first place. At the moment, only really seeing them used for sort of leafy salad crops, things like that, but there's lots of potential to grow fruit, I guess. I mean, I don't think we'd really be looking at this to grow cereal crops. It's not going to replace field scale farming, but in terms of reshoring fresh produce back to the UK and giving consumers year round, hopefully quite sustainable salad crops, I think there's a lot of mileage there. So in terms of my involvement, and this is perhaps sort of more viable if we're talking about a local scale, but I grow microgreens in a small, well, I guess it is a vertical farm at home, but the quantities you can produce like this are significant. So I'll produce 2 or 3 kilos of salad crops effectively from those shelves a week, which you can sell locally. So again, it's cutting out any sort of transport emissions in terms of getting produce to consumers. They're extremely nutrient dense, so potentially an option for people to grow salad crops in a very local way. There's a lot of hype about it. Some of it is justified, but I think there's certainly some interesting opportunities there. You might have heard about agroforestry as well. I think we talked about on-farm carbon storage. So here, farmers basically integrate production, agricultural production and forestry, whether it's planting trees amongst pasture, or the bottom one there, that's Wakeland's agroforestry in Suffolk, where they grow cereal crops amongst the trees, and the trees provide habitat and shelter. And if you were to plant fruit trees, you could get a fruit crop from them as well. So helping overcome some of the challenges around land use. You're not talking about getting rid of farmland, you're kind of complementing it, and hopefully storing quite a lot of carbon as well with the trees. So increasing interest in this, it's quite a sort of a new sphere, because obviously it takes 20-25 years for the system to establish properly. There's not a huge amount of data, and planting trees is quite a permanent thing, but it's certainly a very exciting area, and this will be something that will be funded by future environmental schemes, no doubt. Pasture cropping as well. So permanent pasture is a massive store of carbon. If managed correctly, it can take up quite a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere as well. So the last thing you want to be doing is to plough up that permanent pasture, because then you'll release all that carbon. And some farmers are looking at ways of, well, they've been doing it in Australia, I think to help with sort of contain moisture. You can grow cereal crops into permanent pasture like this. You graze in between them with livestock, or you can mow in between to keep the grass down. But the permanent pasture helps control weeds, locks up loads of carbon, and then you can kind of combine 2 crops there. So it's quite an interesting system. I know that we'll see more of that in the future. So consumers then, what can you do? Well, I've kind of stayed away from talking about diets, just because I know it's quite an emotive issue. But I think for me, the simplest way of summing it up in terms of supporting this is it's just eat a balanced diet, and with as much seasonal British produce as possible. For farmers, it's very, very difficult to be green if your bank balance is in the red. And as far as I know, the UK farming sector is the only farming sector that's made a net zero commitment like this. And the best way you can support it, really, in my eyes, is to support British farmers. Lots of amazing local producers around here. Farmers markets are cropping up, and obviously it's increasingly easy to get hold of produce online as well. So do make use of that. Ask lots of questions as well. I think if people are selling direct, you have every right to ask questions about asked about their sustainability credentials, obviously in a nice and in a constructive way, but I'm sure people will be interested to talk about it. We've got Open Farm Sunday coming up on the 26th of June as well, so have a look at the website and go and visit some farms. And please also contact your elected representatives about food standards. It's not going away. We're potentially going to sign a trade deal with Australia, and see large amounts of Australian agricultural produce come into the UK, undercutting UK farmers. We've been asking for food standards to be safeguarded by the law, to make sure that British farmers are able to compete on a level playing field, and we're not seeing produce coming in that has a worse environmental or animal welfare standard. And that's really important, because the last thing we want to be doing is displacing the footprint of our food and farming overseas. When I've worked in consultancy, working with some of these big companies, I think one thing that became really clear to me is if you can't measure something, you certainly can't manage it. And bringing production closer to home is the easiest thing you can do to make it more effective in terms of managing your environment. If we have ownership of how we produce food in the UK, it's much easier for us if we have ownership of ownership of the food we consume in the UK, it's much easier to make changes to that system. So I think there are a lot of arguments for sourcing British. Forget about food miles. It's more about traceability and accountability. It was quite an eye-opener for me working with some of these big food companies, just how little they knew about where. So not even, they're vaguely what country their ingredients were coming from, but how they are produced. And trying to implement sustainable systems over that scale is really, really difficult. And obviously food waste as well. I think that's absolutely crucial. I don't know if anyone here has read Project Drawdown or looked at Project Drawdown, but they list eliminating food waste as the most impactful thing that you can do as an individual. Above anything to do with diets or flying less. And that's absolutely crucial. In fact, if food waste was a country, it would have the 3rd biggest carbon footprint globally. So it's absolutely essential. I know farmers have got their role to play as well to minimise waste on farm, but most food waste happens past the farm gate, so homes or food service outlets, things like that. So that's crucial as well. So I think that's the last slide. But I hope that was insightful. It's quite a big topic, but certainly I'm pretty positive about what the future holds. It's certainly a difficult time for UK farming with all the changes in policy and things like that. But I think farmers are. I don't want to say surprisingly, but I've been pleasantly surprised by the interest and the support and engagement we've had when we're talking to people about net zero, climate change and sustainable farming. So I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you very much.
Great. Well, Oliver, thank you very much for that rather comprehensive list of issues that are involved here. And one of the things that struck me was when you were showing the slides early on in your presentation about cow's milk versus oat milk, was how incredibly complicated the issues are. And, you know, we as ordinary consumers really do need to dig deep to understand, you know, what the relative merits of, you know, A versus B are, and how moving, shall we say, from, you know, dairy from cows to, say, oat milk, you know, how complex the issues are. I mean, I personally know a lot of people that are switched to almond milk, and yet, as Colin, our beekeeping expert, would I'm sure agree, the impact of the almond industry in California, which is the biggest producer of almonds in the world, in terms of how their pollination is managed with their bees and so on, has caused horrendous problems to the you know, the people that run the bees, and the bees themselves, of course. So incredibly complicated. Do you feel that where does the primary responsibility for educating the consumer come from? Is it going to be from, you know, agriculture, or is it going to be government? Is it going to be, you know, food bodies like, I don't know, Which or Sustain or people like that, or supermarkets? Can we really rely on them to give us an honest picture? Where do you feel that the main thrust of educating the consumer should come from?
Well, it's really difficult, isn't it? Because there are so many vested interests, and, you know, we have our vested interests, you know, that I don't want to see people displacing, you know, British produce for, you know, alternatives that are made from imported commodity crops, you know. But if I was a commodity crop grower whose produce was going to the UK, I'd, you know, be making the same argument. I mean, no, I think everyone's got a role to play. It'd be nice if these issues were covered more effectively in school. I think there's a lot of misinformation circulating from both sides. You know, you see all kinds of ridiculous claims being made from, you know, by farmers and consumers alike. As the NFU, you know, we've got our education team that are training up teachers to deliver lessons about food and farming. I think we had a real battle getting the government to engage around countryside code this year, you know, as we saw lots of people using the countryside. So I think the appetite and the resources for sort of you know, widespread campaigns are pretty limited. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the thing I struggle with is we are seeing a lot of big food companies sort of embarking on their own sort of education programs, if you like, and you know, like I said, they've got a vested interest. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily the most objective source. I think we've done a lot with the BBC as well, working with some of their science correspondents just to try and explain some of the nuances of these debates, because I think having journalists who have enough understanding to make sure that it's what they're saying is properly nuanced is really important. Because you know, I've been working in agriculture, I don't know, for about 10 years, and there's still a huge amount of things that I just can't get my head around, you know. So it's pretty complicated stuff, and it's often not something everyone has had much experience. I mean, everyone's got experience of education because we've all been through the education system, so we've all got a sort of, you know, vaguely first hand sort of knowledge of it, don't we? But not with farming at all. So I think in answer to your question, there are lots of people who it would be good to hear from. You know, we want to see children you know, educated on food and farming from a young age, so they can make informed choices about you know, supporting producers and what they eat.
Okay, well, I mean, yes, it's you know, it's a simple question, but yeah, requires a lot of thought from a lot of people. And do you feel that we can rely on the government, and I don't necessarily mean just this administration, but, you know, Westminster in general, to drive the overall form of that education and information program, or are they really too closely captured by big money from the various sectors that try and capture government?
Well, I don't know really. I think that's I'll probably say something outrageously and politically incorrect in a minute, because I am here on behalf of the NFU. No, I don't know. I mean, to be honest, we had some really good engagement from MPs and ministers about food and farming. Which we perhaps haven't had in the past. And interestingly, people from all parties as well, which is really cool. So I don't know, it's definitely interest, and I think perhaps how do I say it? Perhaps a more of an understanding and awareness of the importance of these issues as well, which is nice. Agriculture is a lot sexier than it used to be, I think, in terms of political issues. But
yeah, I mean, in a way, this role doesn't necessarily have to get party political. In that, if we had intelligent politics, then it could be a sort of a multi-party approach, so that it doesn't get we don't get into the Yabu politics, which other issues quite easily do.
Yeah,
we've got a pile of questions coming in here, so let me start at the top here and see where we go. There's a question about protein crops, pulses and beans. Most of those are imported, and the question is, are we planning to grow more of them here?
Well, I hope so. I think I forgot to mention Hodmedod's, didn't I, in my presentation, but they're a fantastic company. They're basically the only people doing it, which is why I'm naming them. But they've done a great job in sort of developing a market for UK pulses and legumes and things like that. It's a really, really tricky business. The climate in the UK is not particularly well suited to growing human grade pulses, and I think it needs more research and development to help farmers deal with this. So that's probably why we don't see masses of pulses, but I think people are looking to alternative crops. I saw someone planting a field of soya on Instagram the other day, and I know Soya UK who do that are working hard to expand their area. I think if there's a supportive market, then it's fine. But what's really difficult is if you're a farmer and you plant a field of beans, they're very susceptible to lots of different pests, and if you don't make the grade, it's not a particularly viable crop. So yes, it's difficult to grow human grade pulses in the UK compared to other countries. So they have an advantage, which is why when you buy lentils in the supermarket, beans in the supermarket, Canada, or wherever they might be grown, rather than the UK. But yeah, no, Hodmedod's are doing a brilliant job working with farmers and giving them a really supportive and kind of a long-term market for their produce. But they make it look easy on their Instagram, but you speak to Josiah and the people who founded that, they've had so many challenges to overcome in terms of getting the business to where it is now. So yeah, I think diversity of crops is good, but it will need a lot of support from the supply chain and plenty of R&D, widespread increase.
I think I'm right in saying that Hodmedod's, who are sort of Norfolk based, if I remember right, sort of morphed out of a project in the, I think, late 90s. Was it called East Anglian Food Links?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, around Norwich. Yeah,
trying to basically bring consumers and small scale producers closer together. And obviously Hodmedod's, in a sense, is a way of capturing that value chain between the two, isn't it? The two ends of that, rather than it going off to multinationals here, there, and everywhere.
Yeah.
Do you think there's more potential for that type of more direct consumer stroke producer type of business model than we have at the moment? Because at the moment it's a tiny part of our overall food supply.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think for me it's probably one of the most exciting areas. Not every farmer has the resources, or even not necessarily the skills, but the the kind of situation to do a kind of direct sales business like that. But we're seeing lots of people with direct sales of meat and vegetables, and even increasingly dairy products, which is great. I think not like I said, not everyone can do it, but it's definitely a kind of expanding area of business. And with the internet and social media, and as someone who sells produce to people, it's so easy to set up a website and start selling things. So there are lots of really exciting opportunities and opportunities to reconnect consumers. Like I said, it's not going to work for everyone, and we need to be mindful of that. Just how not every farmer can set up a B&B and a campsite to supplement their income. But yeah, no, I think it's there's a lot to be positive about in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, there are examples, and I mean, you have the example in Huntingdonshire of is it? I can't remember the lady's name now. At Glebe Farm, that is.
Oh yeah, they do oat milk actually. Yeah, from British oats. Yeah,
against the huge Swedish multinational Oatly, aren't they? So it is possible, isn't it? Even in commodity grains like
sure.
like oats, isn't it? Yeah,
definitely.
Okay, we have more questions here. What are your thoughts on the potential for carbon labelling of foods in supermarkets? I think Sweden are embarking on already, aren't they?
I mean, so from my point of view, as someone who has done carbon footprinting in the food chain, I would be pretty against it, purely because I don't think we have the nuance in there. And like I hopefully sort of illustrated in my presentation, there are a lot of other factors, and simply the way they would do it is just using kind of sort of simple baseline values of CO2 equivalent emissions, and that wouldn't take into account necessarily the production systems, and I don't think it would give an accurate representation, taking into account things like the nutrient density and other things as well. I just think it's too nuanced, and we don't have accurate enough carbon footprinting unless you literally do it on a farm by farm basis to get that data. And for a lot of food crops, we'd be talking about grams of CO2, and you'd have consumers making their purchasing just choices based on actually what in the absolute sense is a really, really small amount of CO2, but on the label it would look massive. And so I just think it'd be a bit of a perverse incentive. So I think there are probably other ways of doing it, and you've seen Oatly putting it on their packaging, which is great. But I did a different calculation looking at the nutrient density, and they're not going to put that on their packaging, are they? So I think it's a really interesting area, but we're very mindful of the fact that depending on which carbon calculator you use as well, you might get a different result.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I mean, and the other thing about a lot of these accreditation schemes and so on is, when you're doing your shopping in the supermarket, I mean, there's just so many of these things, and do we really understand what they all mean? And sometimes they do tend to oversimplify things, don't they? But there we go. Cool. Okay, moving on. There's a question coming up here really about the size of agricultural holdings, and in order to get away from intensive monoculture, do we need to sort of change the look of our countryside and move towards smaller fields with more diverse farms rather than I guess sort of 200 acres of rape or 200 acres of wheat or whatever? Does the NFU sort of have any thoughts on that topic?
I mean, the reason we have big fields is because we have big machinery, and the reason we have big machinery is because you need economies of scale, because that's what the market dictates, and we talked about that downward depression of food prices. So I don't know, big farms, that's not something we would, we wouldn't have a position on that as the NFU, and we've got members who are on 10-15 acres, and we've got members who are on 10,000 acres, and they all like to think pretty good farmers. I think we'll probably see people putting in hedges and trees. I showed you some pictures of those agroforestry systems. You know, there's going to be a lot of incentives for farmers to do that, and the only subsidies we'll get from the government will be around environmental schemes like that. So yeah, I think we may well see it, but it all comes down to whether it's commercially viable with machinery, you know. So those agroforestry alleys I showed you in Wakelands, you know, those are tiny. So they're using a really small combine harvester down there because it was quite an experimental system. I think we will see the countryside looking different, but you know, there are factors that determine what farmers can and can't do.
So do you think that sort of Wakelands Farm agroforestry layout could work with, you know, the biggest combines that we have today, which have got a cutting head of, what is it 10 meters, 12 meters wide?
Yeah, I mean, bigger than that. Yeah. No, I think they will, but you know, people are putting it in. So you know, we went to see John Pawsey over in Suffolk the other weekend, and you know, he's putting in, I don't know how big his alleys are, 30 meters or something, you know, to give him space for that combine. So yeah, it's absolutely doable. You know, you just got to be mindful when you're putting the trees in. You've got to take a gamble about how you know, wide an alley you'll need for the next 30, 40 years. But yeah, no, you know, I mean, look, that's just one way of doing it. You know, I'm not sort of suggesting that everyone is going to do agroforestry, but I think it's an interesting and exciting system that there's a lot more interest in.
Cool. Okay. So we have a question here, which is sort of, you know, at a micro level. It says, do you have any thoughts on what our village, and I don't know which village this is, but you know, a village I suspect in central Bedfordshire. Any thoughts on what our village could do to better support our local producers?
That's interesting, isn't it? I think the difficult bit is obviously in East Anglia. You know, most farmers here are producing cereal crops. So as a consumer, you know, it's hard to sort of directly buy from them unless they're doing flour and things like that, which most people aren't. So no, it's something we get asked a lot. You know, I would say there are lots of. I mean, you could use the website Big Barn. And that's something an NFU member started, which sort of showcases all the local producers in your area to help you perhaps find people that you might not be aware of. But no, it's it's difficult. I'd say farmers markets, but even just, you know, buying British produce, like I said, you're making sure that money is being invested in the environment in the UK.
Sure.
So that's a step, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like big combinable crops, there is a farmer down near the South Beds border, or I'm not quite sure if he's over the border in Hertfordshire near Hitchin, that does rapeseed oil.
Yeah, the Middletons. Yeah,
Middleton's oils or something.
Yeah,
like
exactly. So there are people like that, and you know, we'll see more people going down the direct route. I've seen a lot of farmers recently buying little small scale mills to do their own flour to sell to people. Right. So it's it's an exciting time.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, I suppose in a way, is this going to come for the impetus for this? Will that come from farmers, do you think, or should consumers, perhaps in this village in central Bedfordshire, perhaps the consumers should sort of get together and engage with possibly NFU farmers to perhaps do something that's relevant, that works for both sides there. I mean, do you think the average NFU farmer would be amenable to an approach from a bunch of consumers locally?
I mean, I don't know. It depends very much on the farm, who it is and what they're producing. And we're working with local authorities for both Bedford Borough and Central Beds as to how we can help broker these kind of relationships. Because I guess not everyone wants to run their business along those lines for a variety of reasons. It's quite time consuming dealing with customers, and there's sort of a whole nother element of admin that you need to do. So I like to think they'd be open-minded. You can certainly ask, but it does depend on the farmer themselves, doesn't it?
I mean, if they're focused on supplying into the the international markets, commodity products, then dealing with local consumers would be at the opposite end of the scale, really, wouldn't it? Yeah. Okay. So another question here. Do you see the UK becoming more self-sufficient in food? Is it possible, or is it dependent on government policies?
Well, I think, as the NFU, that's something we've been pushing for. We were really keen to get food security mentioned in the new agriculture bill, and now the government has to report to Parliament, or I can't remember if it's every 2 years or every year on UK food security. So at least it is being talked about. Clearly we're not going to be completely self-sufficient in food, but I think from our point of view, we'd like to see the balance move back in favour of UK produce. I know whether that means more horticultural production, so growing more fruit and veg here rather than importing it. I don't know, but yeah, I'd like to think so. I mean, it's difficult, isn't it, as the population grows? But hopefully now people have more understanding and awareness of food and farming. There'll be more support for British producers.
Sure. I mean, you mentioned the new project of vertical farming at Sharnbrook, Grow Pura, as a means of producing year-round salad crops in this country, whereas an awful lot of our salad crops is actually imported from those vast polytunnels in southern Spain, isn't it? Do you think that are there any early indications in terms of whether the Sharnbrook experiment is going to be cost neutral, or will it be significantly more expensive? What are the early indicators on the economics of that?
I honestly don't know. You've not got your transport costs, have you? So I don't know. You'd like to think. I mean, I imagine it's costed up, isn't it? So the economics will stack up. I mean, we have lots of people growing outdoor salad crops in the UK, but obviously it is more seasonal. So I honestly don't know. I think we'll wait it with interest. I mean, there are other people doing similar things, around the UK already. So I think there's definitely a market for it.
Mm-hmm. The other sort of idea which has come across my radar is this idea of growing. I'm trying to think of the phrase now. It's called aquaponics. So this is sort of growing fish, freshwater fish, in conjunction with salad crops. In a sort of a closed loop system where the waste from one part of it goes into the feedstock for the other part of it. Is that up on NFU's radar, or are these just really sort of hobby type things that people are experimenting with?
Well, I mean, this is really early stage. So no, I mean, I think we're sort of looking at these things with interest. There was a company doing aquaponics, on trying to do it on a commercial scale in London, but I think the outlay for the infrastructure was too much, and they folded a couple of years ago. No, I don't see this replacing field scale agriculture sort of in the near future, but I think it's definitely going to supplement it. It's an interesting area. We've not got any vertical farming members just yet, but who knows? I mean, some of the glasshouse producers, if you go to Lee Valley, where most of our peppers and tomatoes are produced, they're doing amazing things with technology there. So I reckon they'll probably be the first to start doing things like this.
Mm-hmm. Am I right in thinking that there was locally some plans to have a sort of a local equivalent of Planet Thanet, this sort of massive glasshouse in Kent that grows, is it tomatoes and cucumbers, somewhere in connection with a thermal power station somewhere in the Bedfordshire, Hertfordshire area, Bedfordshire, Huntingdonshire area?
Yeah, I honestly don't know. I wouldn't be surprised.
Okay,
I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah.
So, what are the NFU's thoughts on how technology is going to help reduce the footprint, eco footprint of agriculture? What do you think are the most promising emerging technologies for that?
I think it's going to be key, and we have everyone in our membership. We have some people who don't use a computer because they actually might not need to. Their business is running that way, and we've got some people who use a drone every day. Your average crop producer, probably has more computing power on their tractor than my whole office does. So it is highly technologically advanced. Your fields are mapped out in terms of the nutrient requirement for each area, which allows you to do variable rate application. So you can absolutely tailor everything you're putting on, you know, to minimize any kind of waste. So that's going to be key. I think one of the interesting things is the use of data on farms. Farmers are being encouraged to collect more and more information, and I guess now the next step is to look at how we can actually help them use that and turn it into decision making. So in the context of carbon footprinting, that would be really key. So I guess the challenge is to come up with a really good carbon footprinting tool that is sort of used across the agricultural sector, rather than everybody using different ways of measuring the footprint, and then the technology in that to turn it into management decisions for farmers to help, you know, govern what they do on a daily basis. So yeah, no, technology is absolutely key. You know, the government are sort of helping farmers invest with grants, so it should improve their productivity and carbon footprint at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that the local agricultural colleges, I'm thinking here of Shuttleworth, for example, do you think that they can contribute to research in that way, or is that sort of outside of their sphere of operations?
Well, I don't know how much Shuttleworth do in sort of research on that front. I think, you know, having spoken to Shuttleworth students, they're very engaged with what the future looks like, and the sort of the level of technology. It's kind of the norm now. But, you know, if you go to some of the agriculture universities like Harper Adams or dare I say it, arch rival down in Cirencester, you know, they're doing lots of really exciting research on robotics, automation, things like that, and that's commonplace. So yeah, I think change is happening pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. You know, here in Bedfordshire and Huntingdonshire, we don't have a huge industry that uses lots of seasonal workers from overseas, do we? Really, we don't have sort of major soft fruit industry.
No, very little.
But I mean, I think, you know, they're talking, I believe, about using robotics for some of those very labour-intensive things like picking strawberries, for example.
Yeah. The soft fruit is the elusive one because obviously they're so easily damaged. I think if you went on the average commercial vegetable farm, you know, you've got computer guided hose to weed without using chemicals. You know, people are looking at kind of using lasers to kill weeds. The level of automation is significant. Yeah, but access to labour is challenging because it's a seasonal role. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a seasonal role which doesn't work necessarily well for domestic population.
Sure. Okay. A question coming in here. That's Bedfordshire Climate Change, have pondered the question, could Bedfordshire feed itself? With all the sustainable stops put out, what do you think this could look like in reality? Do you think, I mean, obviously we're not going to be growing bananas or pineapples,
no.
Not anytime soon, but in terms of, you know, the bulk of the sort of food that most of us eat, how sustainable could Bedfordshire be, or do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I think I honestly don't know. I wouldn't be able to, you know, you'd have to work out the land area and things, wouldn't you? But, you know, there's a heritage of fruit and veg production in this part of the country. You know, there are still some vegetable growers. We've got glass houses. You know, the infrastructure's there, isn't it? We've got dairy farmers, we've got livestock farmers, we've got crop producers. So you like to think if you put the right relationships in place, then hopefully, I guess, you know, with some innovation, yeah, I think we have to see, wouldn't we? Well, probably don't want to just embark on it without making sure it's going to work.
Sure, and of course, you know, the other problem with land is that, you know, we keep covering more and more of it over with houses and industrial estates and other types of infrastructure, which takes us into a whole other area. So I think we'll just park that one there. Let's have a look what other questions we've got. So what's the difference between gene editing and genetic modification or genetic engineering? Is it basically the same thing with a slightly, you know, more friendly title, or is there a significant scientific difference?
I mean, I'm not the expert on this, but the most recent consultation was on a series of new techniques around gene editing. So editing specific genes within an organism rather than introducing new new DNA. So we're not sort of talking about Frankenstein foods. This was kind of switching things on and off. So particular traits that might take you 20 years to breed. I don't know, drought resistance, you can switch it on and off with this new technology. So the debate was about whether they are classed as GM and whether they should be regulated as such. You know, I've got to say, it was, you know, that it is quite a contentious issue. I'm probably, like I said, not particularly well qualified to talk about it, but we discussed it at length within the NFU, and you know, they were all different views. I think so. Our sort of response was cautiously optimistic about the potential, but obviously it needs to be regulated and researched adequately. But you know, there are people in other countries doing this, and I guess the concern is that if these crops are going to come into the UK and undercut farmers, then you know, surely it would be better for UK farmers to be able to use these techniques in a properly controlled manner. But yeah, like I said, that's probably a whole nother debate. How it fits into net zero, I'm not probably qualified, but you know, if you've got crops that are well suited to low input systems that don't need the inputs that other crops might need, you know, you've got savings there. But yeah, you'd have to ask someone a bit cleverer than me.
Okay, all right. Well, what about sorry, the question, I'm having a senior moment here, that the question I was going to ask has popped out of my head. So I'll move on to the next one on my list here, which is how will the sort of changes that you've been envisaging help restore biodiversity with the rider, which is currently in horrific decline in Britain? So the changes, but particularly, I guess, coming up under the ELMS scheme, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, how's that going to impact on biodiversity, do you envisage?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth saying that, you know, farmers are already putting a huge amount of effort into putting in environmental areas, and you know, a lot of the damage we saw was done sort of, you know, in the 1970s when hedges were ripped out due to subsidies and things like that. And since then, you know, farmers have been working hard to restore where we got to. But yeah, it's you know, we need to take it seriously. It's the farmer's job to look after the environment they work in, isn't it? So in answer to your question, like I said, the only money farmers are going to get from the government now is for environmental outcomes. So most people are doing it because that's, you know, they're interested and engaged with it. But ultimately, there's a financial incentive as well from a business point of view. So you know, we certainly encourage all our members to get on board with these environmental schemes. You know, we'll see more habitat on farm undoubtedly, and in the new environmental schemes, the third part of that, so there's sort of 3 different levels. The third one, which is landscape scale, you know, we'll almost certainly see land taken out of agricultural production permanently, effectively, you know, to revert back to nature and provide habitat. You know, so we'll see quite a big change in the countryside, I imagine.
Oliver, do you think that you know, there's you know, not sufficient incentive, particularly for tenant farmers, to engage in some of these changes? So, for example, if you were going to go down, you know, the agroforestry route, where you're planting a strip of trees, you know, every 20 meters or whatever it is, the main benefit from those trees in terms of crop, be it timber or be it, you know, nut or fruit, whatever, is not going to materialize, you know, until 10, 15, 20, 30 years later. Perhaps longer if you're, you know, growing things like walnut trees and so on. Are there sufficient incentives there for tenant farmers to be able to capture that value if they, you know, if their lease, you know, terminates, say, 5 years into a 15-year project?
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, bit careful, because I can see this getting political. Again, but you know, pretty much half our farmers are tenants, aren't they? So it's really relevant, and it's something we really engage with as the NFU. You know, I like to think most landlords are supportive of this, but yeah, it depends on the landlord. And I've got members who basically haven't been able to get into environmental schemes for the reasons you've described, because you know, the landlord doesn't want to have the kind of restriction imposed on them, and it's something that the government really needs to take into account with these new schemes to make them viable for tenants. So one of the things we're pushing, we want to have effectively a range of schemes, so some that might be 2 or 3 years, if not less, and some that are kind of 25, 30 years, so that as many people as possible can get involved. But no, it's it's a really interesting, it's a really difficult issue, because I don't know what it's like in other countries, but a lot of the land in the UK is tenanted, and we have some fantastic, really forward-thinking, supportive landlords, but you're always going to get people who are difficult as well, not difficult but have constraints.
Do you see in the Bedfordshire and Huntingdonshire area investments coming in from, shall I say, financial institutions buying up land for their strategic purposes, as opposed to land changing into the hands of traditional landowners?
I don't know really. I'm not necessarily sort of engaged in that issue as much as sort of land agents and people like that. And we have everyone in our membership. So we've got people who have thousands of acres and people who have tens of acres. It's an attractive investment, isn't it? Farmland. At the end of the day, if these people are willing to invest in the environment, then crack on. I mean, I don't know. Again, I'll be a bit careful here before I say something outrageous and controversial. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's there's certainly a lot of development going on, isn't there, in this part of the country. But a lot of our members are involved in that because it's how they ensure the long-term viability of their farming business. So I'm not going to criticise that, definitely.
Sure. Okay. Got a couple of questions coming in here regarding the move towards droughts as our climate changes, and as you said in your introduction, we've had a very dry spring and a very cold April. What are the sort of the landscape scale changes that need to be made to try and ensure that, for example, our water tables don't keep falling? I mean, I know there's projects to sort of restore chalk streams, which obviously is applicable to the southern part of the area you cover.
Well, I think at the heart of it, the simple things farmers can do are around soil health. So organic matter in the soil helps act as a sponge to store water. So there are a lot of other incentives alongside carbon storage, to encourage farmers to have healthier soils. But it's difficult. I mean, people are putting in irrigation infrastructure, so reservoirs on farm, so they can fill them when it rains. We've got surplus water, they can make sure that's stored, and then they can redistribute that through irrigation if we're growing onions or potatoes or whatever it might be. It's a real challenge, to be honest, the water side of things. And of course, I mean, the other end of the spectrum is using farmland as a water storage when we have flooding, to minimise the flooding on downstream settlements. Is there much potential for that in the I suppose in North Bedfordshire and Huntingdonshire? I mean, that's basically dominated by the Great Ouse, isn't it, really? Yeah, I mean, this winter we saw some really major flooding, and it's a pretty sensitive issue because a lot of people's farmland, and last winter as well, was basically rendered unfarmable for the coming year, which is quite horrific. So there's a balance there. Floodplain is a floodplain, that's what it is. So often you'll see people grazing livestock on it because you wouldn't want to grow crops there. I'd like to think that we've got various bodies who work to manage the catchment areas of all these different rivers, and we're really involved in that. I'd like to see everyone working together to do their best on that, and there are lots of different interests that need balancing, but ultimately, if I don't know, I'd like to see farmers recognised for the role that they play in helping manage flooding as well, if they've got floodplain as part of their land.
Do you feel that the large developers, and I'm thinking particularly here of the people that do the mega industrial parks, you know, like we've seen lots of warehouses and obviously associated areas of tarmac spring up along the A41 between Bedford and Milton Keynes over the last few years. And, you know, the major housing developers, do you feel that they're engaged enough in this process, or in terms of mitigating the impacts of covering over the countryside in concrete, if I can use that slightly pejorative term?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of loath to get into that sort of debate about about development, like I said, because it's you see it from the point of view of a farmer who it might be their land that's being developed. It's pretty complicated. But I think one thing I could probably talk about is we've been involved in the new A14 project, and there are all sorts of flood attenuation works and flood management things that they put in to deal with water that comes off the road. And we've seen some farmers who have had land flooded where it's never flooded before, possibly as a result of that. So yeah, you definitely need to take it seriously. It's a complicated issue, but yeah, I'd rather not get into kind of the debate about development and things like that, because it's pretty contentious. I can see at least one farmer on the call as well, so I've got to be on on best behaviour. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, let's not put you through the grill anymore. This is a slightly less contentious issue, I think. Question here saying there used to be a research centre at Silsoe. Sadly, the government closed it in 2006, but there's still a company based in Silsoe developing vision-guided hose for inter-row hoeing and spot herbicide application. So I'm not quite sure what the question is, but are you aware of them? And is this technology viable and workable and so on?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of inter-row hoeing is if you're sad like me, it's enormously exciting. Actually seeing it in action is really cool. But technology is coming on leaps and bounds, and largely driven by the horticultural sector initially. So yeah, I think I'm not really sure what the question is, but yeah, it's all very exciting stuff.
Okay, all right. Okay, so it sounds a bit like toys for boys sort of thing, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I couldn't possibly comment. Yeah.
Okay, so question coming up here saying planting trees takes 10 to 15 years before they start seriously absorbing CO2. Wildflower meadows, pasture land tends to absorb it much more quickly. So rather than the sort of emphasis that appears to be on lots of tree planting, and I think when we had the last general election, I think all the parties were trying to outbid each other in terms of how many billions of trees they would plant. Would it make more sense to be perhaps putting more effort into meadow planting rather than tree planting?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll definitely see that in the new environmental schemes. I think, like I said before, I talked about how well-managed pasture and meadows can lock up huge amounts of carbon. So there's a lot of potential there. Yeah, I think we need to do all of them though. And yeah, tree planting it's not a silver bullet, because if it's done in the wrong place with the wrong trees, you can even make things worse. And with the dry spring we've seen, I know a lot of people were quite worried about the trees they put in this winter not making it through because it was just so dry. And obviously when they're young like that, they need regular water. So it's not kind of a given that they'll even mature.
Okay. Rather a long question here, but if I can summarize it, basically there's a lot of smaller autonomous electric vehicles coming to the market, apparently, to downsize farm vehicles, because you don't have to, provide a big vehicle for a big farmer to sit on. So with these new electric vehicles, lower compaction, etc., I think that the gist of the question is, could these vehicles, which are going to be quite capital intensive, are they likely to reduce the amount of, is the benefit coming from them going to offset the savings in labour costs, do you think? What's your feelings on that?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, it would depend on the farm, wouldn't it? But that's why it's so important we have these capital grants from the government. A lot of farmers, they've got so little capital available to invest in new technology like this. Making the jump to kind of the next stage of business is really difficult. I think there's a company called the Small Robot Company who are making, I think this is what this person's talking about, sort of semi-autonomous, really low impact robots. We'll definitely see more. We'll definitely see more of it. I don't know how the economics stacks up, but like I said, access to capital can be really difficult for a lot of farmers.
Okay. One thing we haven't touched on, I know it's an issue, is the age of the average farmer. What do you feel needs to be done to encourage younger people to actually see farming as a viable either business option or a career option? Because am I right in thinking that Bedfordshire and Huntingdonshire are pretty much like a lot of the rest of the country, where the average age of the farmer is in the early 60s or something like that?
Yeah, and I don't want to offend any of our members, but no, it's the average farmer tends to be quite an elderly demographic. It depends if you're talking about the decision maker or the people working on the farm. But yeah, I come across members all the time who because it's a difficult job, and there's no guarantee that your business is going to be viable in the future. It's for a lot of people, if they're handing on the business to the next generation, it can be really challenging. Especially as things change. We're really keen to encourage the next generation. I think there's been a massive increase in people studying agriculture at university, which is great and is really exciting, because it's not just a tiny proportion of the actual jobs in the sector are farmers. That for each farmer, there's a whole army of consultants and advisors and researchers and people like that. So there are a lot of really exciting opportunities. I think the kind of the link with agriculture and climate change has brought it into public consciousness a lot more. But yes, access for new entrants is really difficult. We did a webinar on it with sort of our next generation members quite recently, and there's some really challenging discussions, I think, about access to land and how you get your foot on the ladder and how you access that capital. One thing that is happening though is, as the subsidy payments are being phased out, farmers hopefully are going to be able to access a lump sum, so they'll be able to get the next few years in one go to do what they want with it. And the idea being that they'll take that as a bit of a golden handshake to leave the industry and hand it over to the next generation, because I think there are a lot of people just sort of waiting to see what's going to happen in the next couple of years as to what to do with the business. But no, it's really sad for me when I see someone with a really good business and the next generation just aren't interested for whatever reason. I can't necessarily blame them, because it's a pretty challenging prospect.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, especially if you're in the dairy business, the idea of a job which is a 365-day-a-year job. It's a tough one, isn't it? It's a tough one. Okay, well, Oliver, I think we've got our money's worth out of you tonight. Thank you very much indeed for coming along and talking and answering all of these really diverse questions. We've had a really good selection of questions coming in from our viewers, as it were. So thank you very much for that. And I don't know if you want to sort of close with any final remarks.
I just wanted to say thank you for having me. I think climate change is an issue that affects us all, isn't it? And like I said, farmers want to position themselves as very much as part of the solution. So I would say there's misinformation about food and farming on all sides of the debate. So be cautiously critical about things that you read, and make sure that you listen to what farmers are saying about what's going on, as well as other people. But I'd encourage everyone to get out and about, get down to the farmers market, meet some of your local producers, and just generally support British farming as best you can, because it's much appreciated.
Cool. Okay, thank you. Just one final question. I don't know whether you've got this answer at the tip of your tongue, but you mentioned Open Farm Sunday, which is coming up. That's normally in mid-June, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think it's something a bit earlier, but they've moved it later so as to be after the lockdown restrictions.
So something like the 3rd or the 4th Sunday in June, will it be? Or
yeah, it's the 26th of June, I think, off the top of my head. So you'll have to look at the website to be honest, I don't know what people are doing in terms of hosting it, how many people will host it this year. I like to think as many people as possible will. But yeah, get on the website and have a look at hosts near you and make the most of it.
And so the website, the search should be Open Farm Sunday.
Yeah, it will come up. You just search for Open Farm Sunday. It's an established thing.
Well, with you know, people wanting to get out and about, I suspect there might be quite a bit of demand this year.
Yeah, I hope so.
Have to order in some extra long trailers to take people on farm trips. Oliver, thank you very much
No worries.
on behalf of you know, the BCCF committee. I know Colin Hall and you have put a lot of effort into sort of setting this up and agreeing a mutual time and so on. So thank you very much to Colin and yourself. And on behalf of all of our viewers, listeners, thank you very much indeed.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
You made it, Heather.